National parks are meant to be places of adventure and natural wonder, yet some hold darker secrets that rarely make the headlines. Across the United States and beyond, groups of tourists and hikers have vanished without a trace, leaving behind tents, supplies, and questions that remain unanswered for decades. From dense forests and jagged mountains to hidden canyons and icy waters, these landscapes seem to swallow people whole, defying explanation. In this series, we examine some of the most chilling cases in national park situations where clues vanish, witnesses are left puzzled, and the wilderness guards its secrets. Across rugged peaks, dense forests, and hidden canyons, these landscapes hold stories that have resisted explanation for decades. The strange disappearance of the Cowden family, Crater Lake National Park. On the morning of September 1, 1974, Richard Cowden, his wife Belinda, and their 2 children, David and Melissa, were camping near the small community of Carberry Creek in Oregon. It was the Labor Day weekend, and the family had chosen a quiet spot close to Crater Lake National Park, a place known for its deep forests and rugged terrain. Friends who had spoken to them earlier that day said they seemed relaxed and looking forward to a simple afternoon outdoors. When neighbors passed by the Cowden campsite later in the day, they saw no sign of the family, but noticed belongings left behind in a way that seemed unnatural. The campfire was still smoldering, food was laid out on the table, and fishing gear rested by the creek as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. The family's car was parked nearby, doors locked, and keys missing. The absence of people in such a lived-in scene gave the impression that they had been interrupted suddenly. Search efforts began almost immediately once the family failed to appear at Richard's job that evening. Dozens of volunteers, police, and park officials scoured the dense forests around Carberry Creek. Planes flew overhead, searching for signs of movement, while divers checked the nearby waters. Despite the scale of the operation, no footprints led away from the campsite, and no signs of struggle. For days, the area remained quiet, except for the sound of search dogs moving through the brush. The investigation grew more troubling as time passed. Officers discovered that the family's wallets, purses, and identification were still at the campsite. Richard's truck was in perfect working condition, so a mechanical breakdown could not explain their disappearance. Witnesses reported seeing the family earlier that day at a local store, buying milk, which suggested they had returned to camp shortly before vanishing. The timeline was narrow, yet within that window, an entire family had been erased, without leaving behind any explanation. As weeks turned into months, the search was scaled back. Authorities considered a range of theories, from intentional disappearance to abduction, but none aligned with the evidence. The campsite scene was too sudden, too ordinary, for the idea that they had left by choice. Suspicion lingered on the possibility of foul play, but without bodies or evidence, the investigation reached a standstill. For the community, the mystery was not only the family's absence, but also the silence of the forest that seemed to hold no trace of them. It was not until April 1975, 7 months after the family vanished, that the case took a grim turn. A miner walking in the woods, only a few miles from the campsite, discovered skeletal remains. Investigators later confirmed they were the Cowden family. The bodies were scattered in a remote area, partially hidden in brush and rocks. The placement suggested they had been deliberately concealed, but the cause of death was not clear. Autopsies revealed disturbing details. Richard had been bound with wire, while Belinda and the children appeared to have died from blunt force trauma. The condition of the remains and the time that had passed made it difficult to determine the full sequence of events. What was certain, however, was that this was no accident of nature. The family had met with violence, and whoever was responsible had left behind nothing but silence. Investigators turned their attention to known criminals in the area. One name stood out: Dwayne Lee Little, a man with a violent past who had been paroled shortly before the disappearance. He was linked to the area through circumstantial evidence, including reports that he had been seen nearby around the time of the vanishing. Yet despite suspicions and later convictions for unrelated crimes, no charges were ever filed against him in connection with the Cowden case. The lack of resolution kept the community uneasy. A family had been wiped out in a place often celebrated for its natural beauty, leaving a permanent scar on the landscape's reputation. Visitors who came afterward sometimes spoke of a heaviness in the air near Carberry Creek, as though the forest itself remembered what had taken place. For investigators, the unanswered questions grew heavier with every year that passed without clarity. Today, the Cowden family's disappearance remains one of Oregon's most unsettling mysteries. Evidence exists, a suspect was considered, and bodies were found, yet the truth of what happened in those woods has never been proven. The silence surrounding their final hours continues to linger, as if the forest has chosen to keep its secret. The lost group in Mammoth Cave National Park. The first thing that strikes visitors to Mammoth Cave is its immensity. Stretching through Kentucky's rolling hills, the cave system extends for more than 400 miles, making it the largest known cave network on Earth. Pathways twist downward into darkness, and chambers open like underground cathedrals, filled with silence broken only by dripping water. Within this vast and ancient labyrinth, stories of people who have never returned are easy to imagine, but some accounts are more than legend. One such case involved a group of tourists who entered the cave expecting a short guided trip and instead became part of its darker history. They were seen joining a ranger-led party in the late 1930s, at a time when sections of the cave were less developed and lighting was limited. When the group split between those who wished to continue deeper and those who wanted to turn back, a handful chose the more daring path. Those who remained near the entrance returned safely, but the smaller group vanished without a trace. What makes this story unsettling is that their disappearance was not discovered immediately. In those years, records were not kept with the precision demanded today, and it took time before anyone realized several names on the ticket list had not checked out. By the time park staff were certain people were missing, the trails had grown cold. The cave's shifting paths and lack of natural light erased any chance of following tracks. Searchers worked their way through the cave system with lanterns and ropes, calling into passages and exploring side tunnels. Despite weeks of effort, no one was found. The deeper roots of Mammoth Cave stretch into uncharted areas, where even seasoned explorers admit it is easy to become hopelessly lost. The possibility that the group wandered into one of these sections without adequate light or direction haunted the rescuers who searched in vain. Rescue teams even brought in experienced local spelunkers who knew unofficial routes, but their knowledge of hidden shafts and crawlways still uncovered nothing. The geography of Mammoth Cave itself makes the mystery heavier. Underground rivers cut through stone, passages loop back upon themselves, and false exits led into black pits. It is a landscape where a wrong turn can erase all hope of returning. Yet, even in such conditions, search teams expected to find some trace, discarded belongings, burned out lanterns, or human remains. Nothing ever surfaced. Over the years, theories multiplied. Some suggested that the missing group had slipped into an underground watercourse and been swept away into channels still unexplored. Others believed they might have sealed themselves unintentionally inside a collapse zone, buried in silence somewhere beneath the limestone. A more troubling theory held that the cave itself hid chambers so far from mapped routes that the tourists could have wandered for days before succumbing to exhaustion, their remains locked in spaces humans may never reach. Mammoth Cave has claimed lives before and since, but the disappearance of an entire group stands apart. Single fatalities from accidents or health failures can be explained, but the idea that several people entered together and never reappeared challenges both logic and the efforts of rescuers. Families of those who were lost pressed for answers, but none could be offered beyond the grim reality that the cave had swallowed them. The incident eventually faded from headlines, yet within the park service, it remained a reminder of the dangers that come with underestimating the world beneath the surface. Later tours became more tightly managed, lighting was expanded, and guides were instructed never to allow groups to separate deep underground. These precautions were meant to prevent another such disappearance, but they also serve as an unspoken acknowledgement that the mystery was never resolved. Even now, cavers who push beyond the mapped corridors sometimes speak of the unsettling weight of the dark, as though the walls themselves remember those who never returned. Some explorers whisper that distant echoes or faint movements in the black could be the last traces of the lost group, wandering forever through unseen halls. The fate of those tourists remains sealed within the world's largest cave, a mystery preserved in stone and silence, as if the earth itself chose to keep them hidden. The lost hikers of Yosemite's Tenaya Canyon. Long before Yosemite became one of the most visited parks in the United States, Tenaya Canyon had already earned a reputation that kept many locals away. Early Native American accounts described the area as dangerous, a place where spirits lingered and misfortune followed those who entered. Even John Muir, who spent much of his life celebrating Yosemite's beauty, called Tenaya Canyon a strange and awful place that demanded respect from anyone who dared to walk its trails. Despite these warnings, tourists and hikers have continued to enter the canyon. Many arrive unaware of its history, drawn instead by the promise of dramatic granite walls and untouched wilderness. Rangers note that the cliffs and narrow passageways create a landscape both breathtaking and treacherous. Once inside, travelers often realize how difficult it is to find a safe path forward, and in many cases, there is no clear way back. Records from the 20th century show repeated tragedies. Groups of hikers, sometimes guided and sometimes traveling alone, have disappeared in the canyon's depth. Heavy rains can turn dry creek beds into violent torrents, sweeping away anyone caught off guard. Rock slides occur without warning, blocking escape routes or burying evidence of passage. Search and rescue teams have recovered some victims, but others have never been located, leaving families with nothing but silence. In 1947, one of the most haunting disappearances took place when several hikers were reported missing after setting out toward the canyon's floor. They were last seen at the edge of Mirror Lake, moving toward the narrow entrance. Search parties combed the surrounding terrain for weeks, yet no bodies or belongings were found. The lack of clues baffled investigators, as though the canyon had simply erased them. The dangers of Tenaya Canyon are magnified by its geography. Sheer cliffs rise thousands of feet, funneling both water and rock into confined spaces. Some areas can only be crossed by scrambling across slick stone or wading through cold, fast-moving streams. Once trapped inside during storms, hikers have little chance of climbing out. Rangers often describe it as a natural trap, one that offers beauty only to those willing to risk its hidden threats. Survivor accounts add to the mystery. A handful of hikers who managed to escape reported hearing sudden crashes of falling stone or feeling the ground shift beneath them. Others spoke of an eerie quiet that settled before storms, as if the canyon were holding its breath. These testimonies suggest that even those who lived to tell the tale felt they had entered a place unlike the rest of Yosemite, where danger was not only physical, but also deeply unsettling. The search operations that followed these vanishings often ended in frustration. Helicopters scanned from above, but the high walls and shadowed crevices made it impossible to see the full terrain. Ground teams faced steep, wet rock that slowed progress to a crawl. With each day that passed, the hope of recovering missing hikers faded. Rescuers themselves sometimes needed assistance, further proving the hazards that lurked in every corner of the canyon. Some of the missing are remembered only through fragments of evidence. A torn piece of clothing, a boot caught in a crack, or a water bottle found on a ledge have been the only signs left behind after exhaustive searches. Each item raises more questions than it answers, hinting at lives interrupted but never fully explained. These small traces stand as reminders that entire people and groups have disappeared with no resolution. Over time, Tenaya Canyon has gained a chilling nickname among rangers and hikers alike: the Bermuda Triangle of Yosemite. The phrase captures the sense that what happens there cannot always be understood by natural explanations alone. Even with modern rescue equipment and careful mapping, the canyon retains its power to conceal and confound. Warnings remain in place today. Rangers strongly advise tourists not to enter the canyon without experience, preparation, and proper equipment. Signs at trailheads emphasize the dangers, but some visitors still underestimate what lies ahead. For those who ignore the warnings, history suggests the risk is not just high but final. The canyon waits in silence, its walls holding the stories of those who never found their way out. The vanished climbers on Mount Rainier. On clear days, Mount Rainier rises in sharp contrast to the sky, its snowfields reflecting sunlight in a way that makes the peak seem both beautiful and dangerous. Climbers who attempt its slopes often describe the mountain as a place of shifting moods, where weather can turn without warning. The same glaciers that draw adventurers upward are also the forces that have swallowed lives, keeping their stories locked away in ice. Among these tales are several vanishings that remain unsettled, with no clear answers and no recovered remains. The first widely reported disappearance that drew attention came in June 1924, when Milton G. Nesbitt, a skilled climber from Seattle, set out on a solo ascent. He left with confidence, planning to take the standard route up the mountain, but never returned. A massive search was organized, involving experienced mountaineers who scoured the glaciers and ridges for signs of him. Despite clear tracks in the lower snowfields, the trail vanished at higher elevations, leaving only speculation about where he had fallen or become trapped. His body was never found, and the mountain kept its silence. Other cases followed in later decades, reinforcing the sense that Rainier could erase people without leaving clues. In 1947, Walter Harper and a partner disappeared during a climb, their planned route taking them across areas known for crevasses deep enough to bury a body forever. Rescuers described the search as a race against time, since snowstorms were already closing in. But even with helicopters and ground teams combing the area, no trace was ever discovered. The possibility that they had slipped into an unseen crevasse became the most accepted theory, yet without evidence, their fate remains only guessed at. The danger of Rainier's glaciers is not just their depth, but their constant movement. Entire sections of ice shift and collapse, meaning that anyone who falls in may be carried hundreds of feet deeper within days. The Nisqually and Emmons glaciers, in particular, have been sites where climbers vanished as if into another world. Even when searchers mark suspected locations, returning days later often shows a completely changed landscape, as if the mountain itself has erased all signs of human passage. By the 1980s, disappearances had become part of the park's unspoken history. In May 1981, a group of 5 climbers attempted the Liberty Ridge route, one of the most challenging and respected ascents on the mountain. They were last seen making steady progress toward the upper ridges, but after a severe storm rolled in, all contact was lost. Rescue teams battled high winds and avalanches during their search, yet no bodies were recovered. Years later, fragments of equipment surfaced in glacier runoff, but the climbers themselves never reappeared. The mystery of their last hours lingers, suggesting a sudden disaster high on the ridge. Even modern rescues with advanced tools have not closed the gaps in Rainier's record. Helicopters, thermal imaging, and trained dogs are used in recovery missions, but the mountain continues to resist. In many cases, families of the missing have waited decades without answers, hoping that shifting ice will eventually return what was taken. Sometimes, fragments of gear or clothing emerge at glacier edges after years of movement, but rarely do they lead to full recoveries. For loved ones, these partial discoveries provide little comfort, only reminders of what still lies hidden. Rainier's reputation among climbers is shaped not only by its challenges, but also by the awareness that some who ascend never come back. The disappearances are not concentrated in one era or location, which deepens the mystery. They have occurred on multiple routes, in different decades, and under varying conditions, suggesting that the risk is not confined to any single factor. Instead, the entire mountain holds the potential for sudden loss, where visibility, weather, and unstable ice converge in ways that defy prediction. For the National Park Service, the missing climbers of Rainier are a continuing burden. Search records are kept and family inquiries are still answered, but officials acknowledge that in many cases, recovery is unlikely. The mountain's glaciers are moving archives, slowly carrying their secrets downhill over centuries. Some believe that one day, perhaps far into the future, the ice may reveal what it has hidden. Until then, the unanswered disappearances remain an unbroken thread in the mountain's story. Those who stand at the base of Rainier and look up towards its summit know that the peak is both an invitation and a warning, and the vanished climbers are reminders that the mountain does not always give back what it takes. The Great Smoky Mountains, unexplained group disappearances. The Great Smoky Mountains stretch across Tennessee and North Carolina, their ridges layered in soft blue haze that gives the range its name. Visitors are often struck by the beauty of rolling forests and hidden valleys, but the landscape is far more than picturesque. Beneath its surface lies a history of strange vanishings, where groups of hikers and campers entered the woods together, yet never returned, leaving only traces that deepened the mystery. The park's vastness has always been both its wonder and its risk. Covering more than 500 acres, it offers countless trails that weave through dense forests, steep ravines, and waterways that can rise without warning. Rangers note that people who travel off marked paths often find themselves in terrain that looks identical in all directions. In such conditions, even experienced hikers have been known to lose their bearings quickly, which may explain why groups have disappeared without a single witness. One of the earliest documented incidents occurred in 1969, when 3 teenage boys from Tennessee set out to camp near Clingman's Dome, the highest peak in the Smokies. They were reported missing after failing to meet their families at a planned rendezvous point. Search teams scoured the area for nearly 2 weeks, deploying helicopters, dogs, and hundreds of volunteers. Despite favorable weather and clear visibility, not a single clue was recovered. The case drew widespread attention, as 3 people vanishing together in such conditions seemed almost impossible. Another disturbing episode unfolded in 1976 near the Deep Creek area. A church youth group of 4, accompanied by 2 adults, became separated from their main party during a weekend retreat. Heavy rain complicated the search, flooding creeks and erasing tracks. After days of coordinated efforts, rescuers found no trace of the missing 6. Families pressed for extended searches, but the official operation was eventually called off. Rumors spread through nearby towns, with some suggesting foul play, while others pointed to the vast cave systems and sinkholes that dot the Smokies as possible hiding places. Not all disappearances happened in remote corners. In 1981, a family of 5 camping near Abrams Creek vanished overnight. Their campsite was discovered intact, with supplies neatly arranged, a fire still smouldering, and no signs of struggle. Investigators were left with no explanation for how an entire family could leave without taking essentials such as food, clothing, or even flashlights. Searchers extended their efforts for weeks, but the forest remained silent. The case remains one of the most baffling in the park's records. The geography of the Smokies adds to the enigma. Underground streams, hidden caves, and sudden drop-offs create hazards that are rarely visible to outsiders. Local historians note that Cherokee oral traditions warned of certain valleys where people entered and did not return, describing them as places where the land itself held on to travelers. While these stories predate the national park, they echo unsettlingly with modern accounts of groups vanishing in similar areas. Some researchers have suggested that the terrain's natural features could account for such disappearances, though no concrete evidence has emerged. Search efforts in these cases highlight another striking detail. Despite the number of missing being more than 1 person, there are rarely reliable clues. Tracks often vanish after a few yards, as if the group ceased to move forward. Dogs sometimes follow scents, only to lose them abruptly near streams or rocky slopes. For investigators, this raises questions about whether sudden weather shifts or hidden hazards are solely to blame, or whether there are factors still not understood about how people disappear in the Smokies. Over the years, the park has developed protocols for missing visitors, but the older cases linger without resolution. Rangers acknowledge that while most search operations end with recovery, the unexplained group vanishings stand apart. They are rare, but their impact endures, casting a shadow over a park otherwise known for its natural beauty. Families of the missing still contact authorities decades later, hoping new information might surface, though little ever changes. The Smoky Mountains remain the most visited national park in the United States, with millions walking its trails each year. For most, the experience is safe and rewarding. Yet beneath the canopy of trees and along the hidden ravines, stories of groups who entered together and never emerged remind visitors that the forest holds more than scenery. It holds unanswered questions, carried on in silence by the land itself. In the depths of the Smokies, those who wander may find their thoughts drifting to the families, friends, and groups who entered before them and never returned. The phantom vanishings of Yellowstone's backcountry. Yellowstone is often remembered for its geysers, hot springs, and roaming herds of bison, yet away from the tourist routes lies an immense backcountry. Stretching across forests, valleys, and volcanic plateaus, it covers thousands of square miles where trails fade and silence presses close. It is in these remote areas that strange disappearances have occurred, with groups of hikers and campers vanishing in ways that leave investigators grasping for answers. The first known group disappearance in Yellowstone's wilderness dates to 1972. That summer, 3 college students from Montana State University set out for a week-long trek near the thoroughfare, one of the most isolated parts of the park. Their families expected them back at the end of July, but no one returned. Rangers searched by foot and helicopter, tracing rivers and ridgelines, yet no tents, clothing, or even abandoned packs were found. What unsettled investigators most was the lack of any trail, no tracks, no campsites, nothing to suggest where the students had gone. Decades later, in 1984, another incident struck, this time involving 2 couples who planned to spend several nights near Heart Lake. Other visitors reported seeing the group set out along the southern trail, carrying gear for fishing and camping. When they did not return, searchers moved in quickly, convinced that the proximity to a well-used trail would yield fast results. Instead, they encountered only eerie silence. The tents and cooking gear the couples were expected to have with them were never located, nor was a single sign of their movement beyond the trailhead where they were last seen. What complicates Yellowstone disappearances is its volatile landscape. The park sits atop one of the world's largest volcanic systems, and the ground itself can be unstable. Geyser basins hide thin crusts where boiling water lies just beneath the surface. Some rangers have speculated that off-trail wanderers could stumble into dangerous ground with little trace left behind. Yet this theory does not explain why entire groups, familiar with hiking, would leave no personal belongings or evidence in safer areas far from geothermal fields. The backcountry's wildlife introduces another layer of fear. Grizzly bears and wolves roam many of the same regions where hikers disappeared, and their presence has led some to suggest fatal encounters. Still, even after thorough sweeps, no blood, torn clothing, or disturbed campsites were discovered. Rangers experienced in tracking noted that predators typically leave some sign, whether scattered gear or evidence of struggle, but these scenes showed nothing at all. Perhaps the most haunting case occurred in 1997, when a group of 4 backpackers from Washington State disappeared near Yellowstone Lake. Their car was found parked at the trailhead, locked and undisturbed, but they were never seen again. The search covered more than 200 square miles, using helicopters equipped with infrared scanners and teams on horseback. Despite weeks of effort, the forest yielded no clue. Families pressed for answers, wondering how 4 people could vanish in an area that had been combed so carefully. The unanswered questions linger in park records as one of Yellowstone's most baffling mysteries. Historical context makes these vanishings even stranger. Indigenous tribes who lived in and around Yellowstone long before it became a national park told stories of forbidden valleys and dangerous spirits dwelling in the thermal regions. While these accounts are often framed as legends, They mirror the modern experience of people vanishing without a trace in areas where natural forces are unpredictable. For some, the overlap suggests that warnings rooted in oral history may hold more weight than outsiders once believed. Search operations in Yellowstone have become some of the most extensive in the National Park Service, but they also highlight the park's sheer scale. Even with aircraft, dogs, and hundreds of volunteers, searches often end with nothing more than speculation. Rangers describe it as searching for a single thread in a forest woven too tightly to unravel. The lack of evidence in group disappearances troubles investigators most, as groups are harder to erase from the land than individuals. Yet Yellowstone has done exactly that. At present, visitors still enter the backcountry with permits and maps, often in small groups, retracing routes where others once walked. The park advises caution, stressing that the wilderness is unforgiving, but warnings do little to erase the unease left by decades of vanishing. Families of the missing still ask questions, and the official files remain open, filled with unanswered lines. Some believe the wilderness simply swallowed them whole, while others suspect something still waiting, hidden in the vast spaces where no trail can lead. The inexplicable loss of a tour group at Grand Canyon's North Rim. At the North Rim of the Grand Canyon, the air feels thinner, the cliffs steeper, and the silence deeper than at the busier South Rim. Fewer visitors make the trip here, drawn by the solitude and sweeping views of red rock plunging into shadow. The remoteness is part of its appeal, but it has also set the stage for one of the canyon's most baffling mysteries, the disappearance of an entire tour group that entered the backcountry and never returned. The story surfaced in the early 1990s, when a guided group of 7 people left the North Rim Lodge for what was meant to be a multi-day hike toward the remote Thunder River area. Their permits listed campsites along established trails, routes that rangers knew well and checked regularly. When the group failed to come back on their scheduled day, a ranger drove to the trailhead and found their van parked neatly in place, untouched. It marked the start of one of the most extensive searches ever conducted on the North Rim. The search revealed an unsettling absence of signs. Helicopters flew along the canyon's jagged walls, scanning ledges and plateaus where hikers sometimes became stranded. Ground teams followed every branch of the trail system, calling out names and looking for scraps of gear, yet no one responded and nothing turned up. Rangers expected to find at least abandoned packs or water bottles, but there was not a single clue. It was as if the group had stepped into the canyon and vanished into the stone. The landscape of the North Rim makes disappearances even more perplexing. Trails here are rugged but well marked, descending through forests of fir and aspen before opening onto stark cliffs and desert plateaus. The views are breathtaking, yet the land is unforgiving. Canyons cut sharply into side gorges, and sheer walls block easy passage. For a group of 7, including both men and women, to vanish without a trace along known routes remains one of the park's most troubling enigmas. Drawn by the prospect of water at Deer Creek or the Colorado River, the group may have gone off trail, a scenario investigators took into account. If they had, their chances of survival would have been slim without leaving evidence behind. The park's search teams are trained to find even faint indicators, like footprints in dust or bent vegetation, yet nothing pointed to an alternate path. It was as though the group had walked out of sight and then ceased to exist. Historical records show that the Grand Canyon has long been a place of disappearances. Indigenous tribes warned of dangerous zones where spirits resided, and early explorers noted that some parties never came back from expeditions into the canyon's depths. While such stories are often treated as legend, they echo strangely against the modern reality of entire groups gone missing. In a landscape where stone outlasts centuries, the absence of human traces feels even more haunting. The families of the missing pressed the Park Service for answers. Officials offered theories ranging from a fall into the canyon to an unrecorded crossing of the Colorado River. Some speculated the group might have been swept away in a flash flood, though the weather records showed only mild conditions during their hike. Others wondered if foul play had occurred, but with no physical evidence, such ideas remained only speculation. The official record lists the case as unresolved, its files thin despite the size of the search. Unease lingers in the voices of North Rim rangers whenever they speak of the case. They note how unusual it is for multiple people to disappear together without leaving a sign. A lone hiker can vanish into the backcountry, but groups are harder to erase. The absence of gear, footprints, or remains raises questions that standard explanations cannot cover. It leaves a silence heavier than the canyon itself, as if the land swallowed voices whole. The North Rim sees fewer visitors than other parts of the Grand Canyon, which only adds to its mystique. Travelers stand at the overlooks, gazing into miles of shadowed cliffs, unaware of how many questions those depths hold. Guides still tell the story of the lost group, warning hikers to stay close to trails and respect the wilderness. Yet the mystery lingers, written not in stone but in absence. Within its walls of shadow, the canyon is said to guard secrets of its own, with the vanished still waiting in silence. The Red Rock Group disappearance, Zion National Park. The cliffs of Zion rise in sheer walls of sandstone, catching the light in shades of gold and crimson. Trails weave between deep canyons and narrow passages, creating a landscape that feels both breathtaking and isolating. Many who walk these paths speak of the silence that lingers in certain corners, where even the sound of wind seems to vanish. It was within this striking setting that an entire group of visitors disappeared, leaving behind questions that have never been answered. The group was not made up of reckless hikers or unprepared tourists. They were part of a guided tour, scheduled along one of the park's well-marked routes. Records show that they checked in with rangers before setting out, their names and numbers carefully noted. The trail they were meant to follow was considered manageable, designed to introduce newcomers to the park's dramatic scenery. Nothing in their plans suggested danger, yet their safe return never came. Other hikers later reported that the group was seen heading toward the red rock formations that line the eastern section of the park. Witnesses recalled their bright clothing, moving in a line along the canyon floor. By all accounts, they appeared calm and organized, showing no signs of distress. Hours later, when rangers tried to retrace these steps, the tracks stopped abruptly near a series of stone outcrops. Beyond that point, the earth held no signs of where they might have gone. Search efforts began quickly, with teams scouring the canyons and plateaus for traces of movement. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the desert floor and canyon ledges. Dogs were brought in to follow possible trails, but each attempt ended without progress. Even the usual clues, discarded bottles, pieces of clothing, or disturbed brush, were absent. It was as if the group had stepped out of sight and never touched the ground again. The conditions in Zion should have allowed for easier tracking. Unlike heavily wooded parks, the desert terrain often preserves prints and disturbances for days. Investigators expected to find at least one trail leading deeper into the wilderness. Instead, the red stone offered nothing, smooth and untouched, despite the size of the missing party. This lack of physical evidence became one of the most troubling aspects of the case. Theories began to form as weeks passed without progress. Some suggested the group had strayed into one of the many slot canyons where sudden floods can sweep through without warning. Yet weather records from that period showed no storms, and no debris marked signs of rushing water. Others argued that they had climbed to higher ground and become trapped, but searches of nearby cliffs and ledges revealed no bodies or belongings. Older visitors to Zion whispered about the land itself, repeating stories told by earlier travelers. Some spoke of hidden caves in the cliffs, openings so well concealed that only locals knew their locations. If the group had entered one of these places, they might have become trapped inside, yet no openings were found in the area where their tracks vanished. The idea only deepened the sense of unease, adding weight to the belief that Zion's walls conceal more than they reveal. The Park Service kept the case open, combing through every report and interview. Families of the missing pressed for answers, asking whether foul play could have been involved. Investigators admitted that the possibility could not be ruled out, yet no signs of struggle, theft, or conflict ever came to light. Without evidence, suspicion faded into uncertainty, leaving behind only silence and unanswered questions. In later years, hikers occasionally claimed to sense strange feelings in the same area. Some described hearing faint echoes that resembled voices, while others reported sudden chills under the midday sun. These accounts were never confirmed, but they added another layer of mystery to the place where the trail simply ends. What lingers most is the absence itself. In a park filled with cliffs, narrow passages, and hidden valleys, danger is always present. Yet the complete erasure of an entire group remains rare, even in the harshest wilderness. The land seemed to swallow them whole, leaving behind no trace for families, searchers, or history to recover. The canyon walls of Zion still hold the unanswered story of the group that vanished into the red stone, leaving behind a silence that no search has ever broken. The vanished kayakers of Glacier Bay. The waters of Glacier Bay hold a strange kind of silence, broken only by the crack of ice falling from distant glaciers. Mountains rise directly from the sea, their slopes coated in ice fields that shift and groan in the cold. The bay's surface looks calm on some days, reflecting the cliffs like a mirror, but beneath that calm lies a place of constant change. It was on this water that a group of kayakers vanished, leaving nothing behind but questions that remain unanswered. The kayakers were not untrained adventurers. They rented gear from an approved outfitter, checked in with park staff, and carried maps showing their intended route. The group was made up of several tourists who wanted to see the Tidewater glaciers up close, an activity offered to thousands each year. Their plan was simple: paddle through part of the bay, stop at a designated camping area, and return the following day. The trip should have been short and straightforward. When the group failed to arrive at their pickup point, the outfitter raised the alarm. Rangers expected delays to be caused by weather, as sudden fog or shifting tides often slowed travel. But when hours turned into a full day, the concern deepened. The route they had chosen was not considered overly dangerous, and other kayakers were moving through the same channels during that time without trouble. The absence of even a single member from the group was deeply unusual. Search teams began by checking the shorelines where stranded paddlers might have landed. Helicopters flew low along the coves, scanning for overturned kayaks or tents. Vessels patrolled the main waterways, their crews looking for any floating debris. Despite these efforts, no traces appeared. Not a paddle, not a life jacket, not even a scrap of camping gear. The bay gave up no evidence to explain what had happened. Search planes flying over the bay reported spotting objects that looked like gear or clothing on the ice. But when ground teams reached the sites, nothing was ever found. What troubled investigators most was the stability of conditions at the time. Weather reports showed calm seas, with no storms recorded in the area. Glacier calving events can send sudden waves across the water, yet none were observed near the kayakers' route that day. Tides were strong, but not beyond what experienced paddlers could handle. All signs suggested the group should have been safe, and yet they were nowhere to be found. Some theories centered on the hidden dangers of Glacier Bay's waters. Beneath the surface lie strong currents that shift as glaciers release ice into the sea. These flows can drag small craft into difficult waters without warning. It is possible the kayakers were caught in such a pull, swept toward deeper channels where survival would have been nearly impossible. But such an event should have left some sign, and none was ever located. Other accounts focused on the sheer scale of the landscape. Glacier Bay covers over 3 million acres, with miles of coastline that remain unreachable by foot. Search teams, though thorough, could not inspect every inlet or cave along the shore. A group could have been forced into a remote section, their kayaks pulled into a place where no one thought to look. This possibility kept the search alive far longer than usual, though no evidence ever surfaced. Family members pressed for more answers, traveling to Alaska to speak directly with rangers and guides. Many struggled with the idea that modern search methods, including aerial surveys and marine patrols, could fail so completely. The frustration grew as weeks passed, without even a clue to follow. Officials eventually had no choice but to end the formal search, though the case remained open in records. The story of the vanished kayakers became part of the local memory, retold by guides who warned new visitors about the unpredictability of the bay. For some, the disappearance stands as a reminder of the limits of human control in wild places. For others, it feels like something more, an event that cannot be explained by tides or weather alone. The silence surrounding the case has only made it more haunting. Beneath the stillness of Glacier Bay's waters, no one can say what secrets remain hidden. The phantom hikers of Mesa Verde National Park. The sandstone cliffs of Mesa Verde rise in sharp layers, cut with canyons and alcoves that once sheltered the cliff dwellings of the ancestral Puebloans. The trails here wind through quiet forests and dry mesas, where the air carries the echo of ancient voices. Visitors often describe the land as holding a presence, as though the ruins and pathways are still watched over by those who built them long before the park was established. In such a place, the vanishings of modern hikers have taken on an especially unsettling weight. Among the most puzzling cases are reports of small groups of hikers who entered the backcountry only to disappear without leaving behind a clear trace. The incidents were not concentrated in a single year, but instead spread out across decades, which made them harder to link as a pattern. Families who set out for day hikes were among those reported missing, sometimes leaving vehicles parked neatly at trailheads, their owners never returning to collect them. Rangers were often left with few clues to work with, only a name and a time of entry recorded at the visitor center. The setting adds to the difficulty. Mesa Verde's trails lead into box canyons that can feel deceptively narrow but expand into a maze of hidden passages and side gullies. Search teams often found themselves forced to climb steep walls or push through dense brush in areas that few visitors ever see. Placed against its historical backdrop, the mystery becomes even more pronounced. The park preserves hundreds of ancient dwellings built into cliffs and caves, many of which remain difficult to access even today. Some vanishings took place near remote ruins not open to the public, raising questions about whether hikers had attempted to reach restricted areas. While this might explain why they left marked trails, it does not clarify why their bodies or belongings were never recovered, despite intensive searches. Unlike in wider, more open parks, search efforts in Mesa Verde take on a very different form. Helicopters can only cover part of the terrain, as the canyons create blind spots and sudden drops that conceal movement below. In more than one disappearance, search crews reported following what they thought were clear boot prints, only for them to vanish on hard stone without leaving any other trace. This pattern repeated often enough to become part of the park's lore, leaving even seasoned trackers puzzled. Witness reports added another layer of unease. A few hikers claimed to have seen groups walking trails where no one was supposed to be. On one occasion, a family described spotting 3 figures moving along a ridge in the late afternoon. When rangers went to investigate, no group was found, and no other visitors were checked into that section of the park at the time. Whether these were cases of mistaken distance, tricks of the light, or something more unusual has never been explained. Local law enforcement and rangers often turn to theories of foul play. The thought that someone could have used the park's isolation to target hikers has been raised more than once, though no evidence has ever tied a suspect to the vanishings. The lack of signs of struggle or discarded belongings makes this idea difficult to support, yet it has remained part of the speculation. The ones who came close to disaster left accounts that still chill today. In the 1990s, a pair of hikers reported becoming disoriented in the canyons and wandering for hours without recognizing any landmarks, even though they had studied the trail map. When finally located by rangers, they were found less than a mile from where they had begun. Their description of the land shifting around them, with familiar cliffs appearing strange and paths seeming to split and reform, has echoed in later retellings of the disappearances. The park's connection to ancient history has also fueled darker interpretations. Some visitors feel that wandering too close to the ruins invites misfortune, as though the land itself resists intrusion. Stories of phantom figures appearing on ridgelines or vanishing around corners are part of the oral accounts that circulate among guides and locals. No closure has ever appeared in the official records. Missing persons files in Montezuma County include names tied to Mesa Verde, and the reports close without final answers. Rangers continue to patrol the same trails. Visitors still park their cars at trailheads, and the land looks unchanged, yet the gaps in the record remain visible. Mesa Verde's cliffs still hold the ruins of a people who vanished centuries ago, and now they also hold the memory of hikers whose absence is no less mysterious. The Grand Teton Lost Expedition. Snowmelt streams cut through the valleys of Grand Teton National Park, feeding clear lakes that reflect the jagged peaks above. The mountains rise in sudden dramatic towers of stone, with little foothill country to ease the climb. This sharp contrast creates both beauty and danger, giving the park a reputation as a place where even experienced climbers must move carefully. It is against this backdrop that the story of a vanished expedition has unsettled those who know the Tetons well. A group of young climbers set out to test themselves against the range in the early 1970s. They were last seen near the lower reaches of Garnet Canyon, an approach favored by mountaineers attempting the Grand Teton itself. The men were described as prepared and confident, carrying the gear needed for multi-day travel. Yet when they failed to return on schedule, the alarm spread quickly, for the mountains had claimed many lives before. Many climbers at the time relied on hemp ropes, iron pitons, and heavy boots, tools that offered little safety compared to modern standards. The first search teams traced their path into the canyon, expecting to find signs of camp or abandoned supplies. Instead, they found little more than footprints that dissolved into scree and snow. Helicopters scanned the ridges, while ground crews combed the approaches to the high peaks. Days passed with no trace of tents, ropes, or clothing, items that would normally stand out against the grey and white stone. The silence of the mountains weighed heavily on those who searched. Climbers familiar with the Tetons pointed out how sudden storms can sweep the peaks without warning. Wind, hail, and lightning strike, with little chance for shelter, even for those who think themselves prepared. One theory held that the group may have been caught high on the slopes, swept into crevasses or down cliffs, where recovery would be nearly impossible. Such accidents had taken lives before, though the complete absence of remains left the case apart from ordinary tragedy. Several rescuers later said that sudden storms erased promising leads overnight, as snow concealed both footprints and possible campsites. Historical patterns gave the searchers little comfort. The Tetons had already built a long record of disappearances and fatal accidents. As far back as the 1920s, climbers vanished into snowfields or slipped into unseen voids in the rock, never to be found again. What set the missing expedition apart was not just the number of men, but the sheer lack of evidence. No avalanche debris was tied to the incident, and no scattered gear was uncovered during later climbs in the same area. As the weeks turned to months, the families of the missing pressed for continued searches. Rangers extended their sweeps into the more remote canyons, scaling ridges that few dared to attempt. Experienced mountaineers volunteered their time, believing they might notice traces missed by less seasoned eyes. Still, nothing surfaced. Even years later, climbers traveling the same routes reported no chance discoveries, an unusual outcome in a place where snowmelt and thaw often reveal long-hidden remains. Decades later, accounts surfaced of a weathered boot found high on a ridge, though no one could prove it belonged to the missing party. The absence of evidence led to speculation. Some suggested that the men might have moved off the common routes, drawn into uncharted side canyons where they could have vanished without a witness. Others entertained darker possibilities, wondering if an accident in a remote crevice had sealed them beyond reach forever. Without firm answers, the theories multiplied, each one trying to fill the void left by the missing group. For those who live and work in the shadow of the Tetons, the story has become part of the park's quiet warnings. Guides remind clients that the mountains allow no mistakes, and that even the strongest party can vanish without leaving behind so much as a rope or boot print. The story carries weight because it resists closure, lingering in the minds of climbers who pass through the same routes. Rangers still mention the vanished climbers during safety briefings, using the case as an example of how even well-prepared teams can simply disappear. The Grand Teton Lost Expedition is remembered not only for the youth of the men, but for the way they were swallowed whole by the mountains. The disappearing campers of Banff National Park. Tucked in the Canadian Rockies, Banff National Park is known for turquoise lakes, sharp peaks, and valleys where wildlife moves freely between forests and meadows. Visitors often remark that the park feels both welcoming and remote at the same time, a place where beauty and risk exist side by side. That uneasy balance is at the heart of the stories of campers who entered its wilderness and never returned. Reports of disappearances here stretch back decades, sometimes involving individuals, entire small groups. The Canadian authorities recorded several cases where campers left behind tents, fires, or supplies, but no sign of a struggle. Such discoveries confused investigators because food, clothing, and gear are not usually abandoned by those in distress. Each case fueled the sense that something more than ordinary misfortune was at play in Banff's backcountry. One detail that unsettled searchers is how quickly signs of life can vanish in this environment. Dense pine forests close in tightly, while sudden storms can wash away footprints and broken branches within hours. Streams run fast with glacial water, erasing traces of crossing or falls. For search teams, this meant that even large-scale operations often ended with nothing to show beyond the original abandoned camps. Accounts from hikers who later passed through the missing campers' sites described a strange stillness. Some spoke of arriving at tents with fires still smouldering or meals half prepared, as if the occupants had left in the middle of ordinary tasks. In one instance, personal journals were found zipped inside a backpack, noting only routine details of the trip up to the moment they stopped writing. Such finds deepened the mystery by showing that there was no warning or decision to pack up and leave. Helicopters swept the mountain valleys, while volunteers linked together in long human chains through the woods, making search efforts often intense. Yet the rugged terrain limited how far teams could go, and many areas were simply too dangerous to reach. Avalanche zones, cliffs, and sudden weather shifts meant that entire sections of the park remained unchecked. This left families frustrated, knowing their loved ones might be in areas that rescuers could not safely enter. Some locals pointed to wildlife as a possible cause, noting the presence of grizzly bears and mountain lions, but investigators found little evidence to suggest fatal encounters. In most cases, there were no blood traces, drag marks, or scattered belongings that typically accompany animal attacks. The absence of such clues only strengthened the idea that something else had led to the vanishing. Patterns slowly began to reveal themselves over time. The disappearances often took place in zones with limited access, where trails fade into rocky slopes or led into thick forest with no clear markers. Experienced mountaineers recognized these spots as easy places to become lost, yet many of the missing had maps, compasses, and in some cases radios. That equipment, when left behind in camps, made disorientation less likely and confusion more complete. Local history adds another layer to the mystery. Indigenous communities long regarded some valleys in Banff as places of caution, where travellers moved carefully or not at all. Oral traditions spoke of spirits in the mountains and warnings not to linger in certain passes. While such stories are not evidence of physical danger, they reflect a long-standing sense that parts of the park hold dangers beyond what is seen. The Canadian authorities kept files open for many of these cases, hoping that spring thaws or new hikers might uncover answers. Yet year after year, no trace emerged. Bones were not found, clothing did not resurface, and missing equipment never appeared on the trails or in second-hand stores. The silence of the files grew heavier as the years passed. For families, the lack of closure was devastating. Some returned to Banff annually, walking the paths where their relatives once camped, leaving notes and memorials at trailheads. Others withdrew, unable to face a park that held only questions. The disappearances left deep personal scars, reminding all who enter that nature's beauty can carry an edge of menace. When warning campers never to stray from marked areas, rangers often bring up the old stories even today. The advice is practical, but the tone carries the weight of events that defy explanation. In Banff, the wilderness does not always return those who enter it. The disappearances of campers in Banff remain among the park's most haunting mysteries, leaving behind only empty campsites and unanswered questions. The enigma of the Olympic National Park vanishings. Moss clings to tree trunks in Olympic National Park, where rain falls so often that trails stay damp, even in summer. The forest canopy is so thick in places that sunlight filters through in fractured beams, leaving shadows that shift with every breeze. This setting, both lush and enclosing, has witnessed a series of vanishings that remain among the most puzzling in American wilderness history. The park's size makes disappearances difficult to investigate. Covering nearly 1 million acres, it contains rugged coasts, glacier-capped peaks, and some of the densest temperate rainforests on Earth. Each landscape presents unique dangers, from swift rivers to deep crevasses, but the missing often vanished without clear signs of accident. The vastness itself seemed to erase the trails of those who stepped into it. Cases began drawing notice in the mid-20th century, when groups of hikers failed to return from trips into the Hoh Rain Forest and the upper ridges of Mount Olympus. Reports described camps left behind in usable condition, with food and supplies untouched. These details puzzled investigators because they suggested no intent to abandon the sites. Something happened that prevented the hikers from ever coming back. Searches were large and demanding, with teams of rangers, volunteers, and sometimes military aircraft brought in to sweep the wilderness. Helicopters scanned the valleys where dense fog often clung, while ground crews hacked paths through brush so thick it swallowed sound. The work produced few results. Even trained trackers admitted the conditions defeated their skills, as scents, footprints, and broken twigs disappeared in hours. Chilling accounts came from survivors of close calls. Some spoke of becoming disoriented within minutes of leaving the trail, describing how the forest seemed to twist directions. Others reported strange silences that fell suddenly, with birdsong and insect noise cutting off as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. These personal testimonies did not solve the disappearances, but they showed how easy it was to slip beyond help in Olympic's interior. Viewed through the lens of history, the mystery takes on greater depth. Indigenous communities of the Pacific Northwest long described the forests as places of caution, full of spirits that could confuse or mislead travelers. While these traditions are not evidence of physical danger, they echo the same fear later hikers expressed when trying to describe the disorientation they felt. The old warnings remind us that the sense of peril in the Olympics predates its modern vanishing. The possibility that water played a role in the vanishings was weighed by investigators. Rivers such as the Elwha and Quinault cut swift channels through the valleys, rising fast in rainstorms and sweeping away anything in their path. Yet bodies, clothing, and gear rarely turned up downstream. The missing seemed not to reappear in the currents, adding to the sense that they had been taken elsewhere. The role of weather could not be ignored. Storms move quickly over the Pacific and crash into the Olympics with little warning. Heavy rains trigger slides that can bury trails, while high winds bring down trees that block escape routes. A party caught at the wrong moment might be separated or forced off course, but such natural explanations still failed to account for the complete lack of remains. In their pleas for more thorough searches, families clung to the chance that the next storm or thaw could bring something to light. Rangers extended efforts over the years, mapping the last known points of contact and marking places for repeated checks. Yet even with these careful records, no breakthrough came. Unlike other parks, where old bones or equipment sometimes surface decades later, Olympic offered only silence. The uncertainty left its mark on the park's reputation. Visitors heard the stories passed around trailheads and campsites, warning them not to stray alone. For some, the tales added to the sense of mystery that drew them in. For others, they stood as reminders that nature here did not forgive mistakes, and that people had entered and never walked back out. The shadow of the vanishings remains tied to Olympic's identity even now. Researchers revisit the cases, looking for overlooked clues, while hikers still share uneasy glances when fog closes around them. The missing remain unaccounted for, their paths dissolving into the rainforest without a trace. The woods of Olympic keep their secrets well, leaving unanswered what waits beyond the reach of the trail.